Okay, good morning. Buenos días. I'm Erika de la Garza, the director of the Latin American Initiative for the Baker Institute, and on behalf of the Institute and the Council of the Americas, we want to welcome you to this important discussion. When it comes to energy, the Middle East tends to beat Latin America in the headlines. However, despite the little positive coverage that oil-producing countries like Venezuela or Mexico have been receiving, especially lately, Latin America as a region is, or at least has the potential of being, a more important source of energy for the United States than the Middle East. So we have an impressive group of experts here today who will be discussing these issues. Before I pass it on to the next speaker, I need to go over some housekeeping items. The ladies' room is down the hall to your left, the men's room down the hall to your right. When it comes to the Q&A sessions, we ask you to please speak into the mics so that everybody can listen to the questions. There's a mic right here and one over there. And then we recycle, so we need your help during the breaks. If you could please, after you're done with your plates and cups, if you could please place them in the appropriate bins, we would appreciate it. I want to thank our friends and partners at the Council of the Americas, especially Eric Farnsworth and Nicole Spencer, for all their help putting this together, as well as the Baker Institute staff who's been at work to get us all here today. We are delighted to have Susan Siegel with us this morning. She's the President and CEO of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society. We hope this is the first of many collaborations between our organizations so that we can foster dialogue and understanding between the Americas. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Susan Siegel.
Well, first of all, thank you, Erika, for those kind words, and more importantly, thank you so much for the partnership. And I think this is really the first of many ways and times that we will partner. Having spent the last 2 days in Houston, as some of you have already heard me say, I much prefer this today to New York or Washington. You sit in New York and it's cold, and you sit in New York and you also have this view, this very pessimistic view of the world. And when you come to Houston, you say, well, we're in a downturn, but the downturn will end and the world will return to something which is more rational. And frankly, given the fact that I am generally an optimistic individual, I prefer to see the world that way than with the dose of pessimism that sometimes you sit and think about when you're in New York. So it's really a pleasure to be here this morning for this very important conference on energy in Latin America and the hemisphere. For those of you who don't know the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, both organizations, sister organizations, are dedicated to education, debate, dialogue in the Americas. The Council of the Americas membership consists of approximately 190 leading international companies across multiple sectors, multiple countries, and many of you are members sitting here today. And we hope those of you that aren't will get to know more about us over time. Energy is critical for the hemisphere, and thus critical for U.S.-Latin American relations, critical to security, critical to our economic situation going forward, and therefore, for the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, energy is something where we want to have a particular focus over the next few years. It is an important time, as I said, to be working on energy in the Americas. At the upcoming Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the largest natural gas producers, the hemispheric leaders are expected to instruct their ministers to develop a strategy for energy cooperation in the hemisphere. In addition, both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have expressed support for what they are calling the Energy Partnership for the Americas, which would foster cooperation in the region on renewable and alternative energy. This week in Washington, Senate Majority Leader Reid, House Speaker Pelosi, the new Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, and other notables gathered for a half-day conference to begin on how to overhaul the our own energy sector, from increasing renewables to upgrading our energy infrastructure. So this conference and multiple conferences after this conference can surely add to the discussion and the debate. I again want to thank the Baker Institute for their wonderful partnership and collaboration. I want to thank Eric and our team and the team on the Baker Institute for putting this together and giving us this amazing space to hold the conference. We have a great lineup of speakers and panels today. We have top academics, industry leaders, and analysts to discuss the energy sector in the Americas. So again, on behalf of the Council of the Americas and the Americas Society, I want to welcome everyone to what I know is going to be a great day and a wonderful conference. Now I'd like to turn it over to Amy Myers-Jaffe, Wallace S. Wilson Fellow in Energy Studies. Thank you.
Well, we're delighted to see everybody here, and a lot of work went into putting together this conference, so we thank our partners. Our first session today is going to look at energy policy in the Americas. In looking at energy policy around the world, there is no more innovative and willing to experiment place. A lot of the paradigms that we see then spread to other parts of the world start first in Latin America. And so it's a particularly interesting topic to look at the trends and also the paradigms that we're seeing across the region, because we're seeing such different approaches to the organization of energy activity, particularly in exploration and production. We have leading technologies that have come from Latin America, i.e. deep water, the sort of deep water miracle of Brazil. We've seen sort of the lead in resource nationalism coming out of Latin America. We have seen for some of the first privatizations of major state national oil companies coming out of Latin America. So there's a lot of different things, thinking about Argentina, looking at the divide between federalism and local organization of the sector. So there are really a lot of different things to discuss in thinking about future trends for the industry and looking at the precedents set in Latin America and the experiences that each of these paradigms have had as those industries have moved forward. And that is what our first panel is going to address this morning. We have a very excellent panel of experts, and in the interest of time and ample discussion, I am not going to read everybody's bios, but they're in your program today. And our format is going to be this. We're going to have presentations by each of our panel members, and then we will have a discussant. We have a prominent academic, Lawrence Whitehead, here, who's going to join the session after the presentations. And then we're going to open the session up to you, the audience, because we have an audience of experts, many of whom watch these issues very closely, and so we want to invite you. I know a lot of times at conferences you get chastised for not asking a question but making a comment, but our format is the opposite. We'd like to hear your comments, even if you don't have a question for the panel, because we want to have an exchange of views on people's views about these important issues, with an eye to being able to have materials and knowledge that come out of the conference to assist with our research and other work going on at the Institute. So with that, I'm going to start by asking David Mares to come to the podium. He is going to be talking about the Brazilian model. David?
Thank you, Amy. Let's see here. My presentation up. Can you see that? I can't. Okay, I can't see it from here. All right. Okay. I'm going to talk about Brazil briefly, and in particular what I want to focus on is what the administration of Fernando Henrique Cardoso began and what President Lula, many feared, would undermine, and in fact what President Lula has slightly modified, and perhaps actually I'll make the argument that he's made it more possible to do further, to push further. Let's see. The next slide here. All right. Let me start with a couple of key concepts that I think we should keep in mind all day today, but in particular when we're thinking about Brazil. There's a lot of discussion about energy security. It's not usually a concept that's defined. I like to define it as having sufficient resources. Now that's whether it's money from your exports of energy or a supply of energy to support the government's development project. All right? What matters is that it's going to support the government's development project, whatever that happens to be in that country. So that's the way to think about energy security from that country's perspective. Resource nationalism, another concept that's tossed around, not defined usually. I like to define it as the government setting the terms for exploration, production, transportation, and distribution of the energy. Okay, the terms aren't just ownership terms, they're also terms about the economics of all of these things. So energy security and resource nationalism can be actively pursued by importers and exporters of energy. It's not that importers are worried about energy security and exporters are resource nationalists. You can actually get combinations in there that are very interesting. Here's just a very quick table. It selects a couple of Latin American countries, a couple of years, just so you see there's a lot of movement around the issues of energy security and resource nationalism in the hemisphere. I want to highlight Brazil because I'm talking about that. Brazil, we go back to the mid-70s after the first oil crisis. Brazil is very high on resource nationalism, monopoly for Petrobras, monopoly for Eletrobras. The perception that they're very weak in the energy area and they have to take a very strong nationalist stance. The reforms under Cardoso, the constitutional reform and then the petroleum laws in the mid-90s, 95, 97, push Brazil a bit away from resource nationalism. Doesn't bring them all the way. If you see, Argentina drops way down low in 95. Brazil doesn't move as far. There's still Petrobras, there's still Eletrobras. They're introducing some competition in the sector. But they haven't gone to complete marketization. I see energy security increasing a bit. There's more investment. It started before 95. 2001, with the drought and the energy crisis, we would say that energy security in Brazil is suddenly, once again, seen as a very difficult issue for Brazil, even with the increasing liberalization in the energy markets. There was a lot of concern about what was going to happen in Brazil after the energy crisis in 2001. I think in 2008, the Brazilians have moved a little more towards energy nationalism, not very much, a little bit more, but their energy security is clearly on the rise. Okay, so with that as background, let me give you just a couple of slides of what does the energy picture look like in Brazil. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Brazil, here we can see that in 2006, Brazil achieves essentially self-sufficiency in petroleum. They're expected to become an exporter over a period of time because of the great finds that they've encountered, first in deep water and now in the subsalt, the pre-salt layers. Power generation in Brazil is dominated by hydro. This is both a blessing and a curse for Brazil. We'll see in a few minutes how this complicates the Brazilian energy picture because hydropower is very dependent on nature. It's very dependent on rainfall, and there are periods of severe drought, and that creates energy problems. Natural gas, we'll see in a moment, was thought to be a way in which you could deal with that, but it creates a variety of very difficult issues to address. Natural gas, the thing that I want to highlight here is that Brazil began investing in natural gas, discovering natural gas, even before the constitutional reforms that liberalized the energy sector to a bit, even before Cardoso. If you see that slide, you see the big increases are starting after the first energy shock. The energy shock stimulates the nationalists in Brazil to go out and look for energy, and we see that in natural gas. Today, Brazil's proved reserves of natural gas, 12.3 trillion cubic feet. It is a country that is doing very well in its natural gas discoveries. The whole question about natural gas is how do you use natural gas in Brazil in the power sector? We'll see that in a moment in more detail. If we look at the total primary energy supply in Brazil, you can see oil is still a major part of Brazil's energy picture. There's a lot of discussion about alternative energies in Brazil, ethanol. There's certainly a lot of progress made there, but it's still a case where hydrocarbons are a major issue for Brazil's energy supply. You can see hydro there, 13.6, natural gas around 8% of total primary energy supply. All right, let me look at the topic of the panel, which is the energy policy. The thing to understand about energy policy is that energy policy is made in the context of a development policy for the country. Okay, it's not separated from that. It is developed with the idea of promoting a particular project for the country to develop. I want to start with Cardoso. Cardoso's had a personal commitment to growth with distribution. Right? This is a very different approach in Brazil at this time period than in many other Latin American countries where there was a commitment to just liberalize. All right, there wasn't a commitment to distribution, and that, I think, creates a number of problems in other countries that Brazil didn't face and which will make Lula's policies more in line with Cardoso's than you would see in, say, Peru or Argentina or other places where the focus was simply on get the government out of the market and that's all we have to worry about. Okay, for Cardoso, you needed market efficiencies, but Cardoso also understood the need to develop social policy to bring immediate benefits to people in the country who hadn't been benefiting. Okay. The failure of the heterodox policies of the 1980s and early 1990s, in a sense, made Cardoso's project easier to get online because people were very concerned about hyperinflation. Brazilians were not willing to continue to experiment with heterodox policies, and so it made Cardoso's argument that Brazil needed to move in the direction of more orthodox policies easier to sell. And when I say easier to sell, what I'm talking about are constitutional reforms. There was a new constitution in 1988, and in order to liberalize the energy sector, Cardoso had to get the support, the public and the political support, to generate constitutional reforms. So this background here, his personal background, the background in Brazilian society, is going to make that easier. Then you get to the politics of actually bringing this off. And here, a couple of things are very important. The fact that in Brazil, unlike Bolivia, unlike Venezuela, there is no dominant party, okay, means that any government in Brazil, whether it's Cardoso or Lula, okay, is going to have to make a coalition government with other parties. Okay, in order to get the votes in Congress to pass legislation, the government has to bring other parties into their coalition. What this tends to do is moderate the policies of the government, because it's got to bring in people from the right, from the center. Even Lula, as we'll see in a minute, even Lula's got to bring in politicians from the right of the political spectrum in order to get his policies passed. Okay, so no dominant party makes a coalition with the center and the right necessary if you want to have changes in not just the Constitution, but in governing laws. Presidential agenda powers, very important. There's a lot of discussion about Brazil's political system being chaotic, being one in which there's too many powers, politicians change parties, etc., etc. How could you ever get anything done? One of the ways in which you can get things done is that the Brazilian political system is set up to give the president agenda-setting power. The president introduces administrative and budgetary laws to Congress, unlike in the United States. Congress isn't as initiative-focused as the president is. So the executive branch decides to a great degree what is going to be considered, and even after the laws are passed, how it's going to be implemented. The executive has a great deal of latitude there. This gives the president the ability to negotiate. He needs the votes of the people from the other parties, but he can also offer them something. Okay. And in the area of offering, there's also presidential patronage powers, because the Brazilian state is so involved in so many things. It does mean that there are also rewards for those legal rewards. I'm not talking about illegal ones, but legal rewards for those who play ball. For Cardoso, the energy reform had a number of goals that turn out to be fundamental in understanding not only why the energy reform is adopted, but also its limitations. Cardoso wanted to have a secure energy supply for the Brazilian economy, not just because he liked that idea, but he had a vision of making the Brazilian economy competitive internationally. Okay. Later on we'll talk about Mexico. You know, this is a different vision from Mexico. Okay, Mexico isn't thinking about making the economy competitive internationally. Cardoso was thinking about that for Brazil. So it's a very important part. It's not just that we want to free the energy markets. We want to do that for a particular purpose. He understood that it required investment to bring about this change in the energy sector, and it required investment at a time when the Brazilian federal and state governments had limited access to capital. So part of liberalization is to bring in capital to promote this project. And ultimately, Cardoso wanted to break the monopolies in electricity with Eletrobras and in the oil and gas sector with Petroprovinces. The Brazilian petroleum legislation that's relevant for us, 1995 constitutional reform, which breaks the monopoly, 1997 petroleum laws. Together, what they did was they limited Brazilian government holdings in Petrobras, partial privatization, all right? Petrobras, the decision-making power is still with the government, okay, but there is private investment in Petrobras. That combination has made Petrobras into a different kind of national oil company than we see in many other places. The legislation also created a National Council for Energy Policy, a National Petroleum Agency. It called for increased use of natural gas, increased competition in the energy industry, and for domestic and foreign investment in power generation. Okay. It's not just opening up the market to foreigners. There's a lot of domestic Brazilian capital, both in terms of buying shares of Petrobras, as well as in Brazilian companies, Brazilian-owned companies, becoming involved in the industry. In electricity, there was privatization of the non-integrated electricity distribution companies, and the creation of a regulator. The reforms, nevertheless, didn't go as far as Cardoso wanted. We can understand that because of the need for coalitions. And so the reforms were in the energy sector and the electricity sector were blocked on generation and transmission. The regulator's independence is not ideal, okay? Since we have short time, let me turn quickly to Lula, toss out some ideas here. Lula is also committed to growth in Brazil, but Lula has a greater emphasis on distribution. It's not that Lula's administration says distribution and then we'll worry about growth, okay? But Lula pushes distribution up closer to the top than Cardoso had. And you can see this if you look at Lula's social policy and poverty programs. Cardoso started them, Lula broadens them and deepens them. They're not entirely different from what Cardoso had done, okay, but they're broadened and they're deepened. Lula is also faced with a number of problems that are constraints. The same way Cardoso comes in and he's got economic constraints, Lula has economic constraints. The constraints are the energy crisis of 2001 and the drought that created that. Got a lot of people internationally and domestically worried about Brazil's energy situation and a concern that if you move too far away from what we think will work, it could have severe negative consequences. The Argentine debt default is also another problem. Lula is from the left. A lot of people were very concerned about, was Lula going to be a left radical president, and what did this mean? Lula understood that. He understood that before he became elected president. If you watch Lula's political campaigns over time, his last political campaign is significantly more moderate than his prior campaigns. He knows in order to win the vote, he's got to moderate. When he takes office, he knows in order to attract the capital to continue to grow the Brazilian economy and distribute benefits, he can't frighten international capital. He can't make them think that perhaps he will be like the Kirchners in Argentina or Chavez in Venezuela. Okay, so the international financial markets need to be reassured. There's a limit on what he can do. Again, no dominant party, so Lula's got to make coalitions with other parties. Lula's on the left. He makes a coalition that includes a party from the right. Okay, not just to the center, but a party on the right. Okay, and then presidential agenda powers and patronage powers. Let's look at Lula's energy reform, pricing policy. Lula's very concerned about the distributional impacts of what's happening in the Brazilian economy, and the government has been quite willing to use informal pressure to keep lower prices on gasoline, cooking gas, and diesel oil. Okay, there is a regulator there, but the regulator is not sufficiently independent from the government to be able to operate thinking only about what the sector needs. Lula's been very concerned about national procurement, so he's quite willing to push for continued national procurement advantages for national capital over international capital, and the privatization of electricity it's not that it got that far with Cardozo, but certainly it wasn't going any farther with Lula. Nevertheless, Lula also did some things that are in the area that we might call liberalization of the energy market, and that were not expected. In 2004, there were regulatory changes in the power sector to encourage investment in generation and transmission. Brazil has a very difficult situation in power generation because hydropower is so cheap relative to everything else that it makes it difficult to invest in alternative power generation, but hydropower is dependent on the rains, so it's always vulnerable. In the 2001 energy crisis, there was a lot of push to bring in natural gas for thermal power generation. The private sector is very worried about what do you do with that investment when the rains return, and so Petrobras and the Brazilian government had to basically subsidize that kind of investment, and that's a challenge that still faces Brazil today. 2006, 2008, the Lula administration has been fiddling with pipeline reforms to stimulate competition for Petrobras. So they don't want to get rid of Petrobras, but they want Petrobras to be as efficient as possible. Let me end with tossing out some ideas about the challenges facing the energy model. I think we can say that the Cardozo-Lula model is essentially the same model. There have been little tweaking on the sides. One of the big questions is, now that Brazil has the potential for so much more oil and gas, what is this going to do for the attraction of resource nationalism in Brazil? They've been very pragmatic about resource nationalism. They haven't tossed it out the window, but they haven't made resource nationalism the driving force. But there certainly is an argument that countries that suddenly find that they have this much energy are tempted to move in that direction of resource nationalism. We don't know what's going to happen yet in the case of Brazil. Have hyperinflation concerns been replaced by the fears of the economic crisis? The hyperinflation concerns made it easier for Cardozo to bring about reform in the energy sector. Will it be the case that with the economic crisis concerns and all of this new energy here, is this going to mean that whether it's Lula or the next government, and there's an indication that the next government might actually come from the right, is that combination of economic crisis and all of this new energy, is this going to lead in a direction in which the Brazilian government is going to want Petrobras and Eletrobras to do much more investing and therefore push things more in the direction of resource nationalism? Oil, gas, and hydropower projects require massive investments, particularly given the geologic characteristics of Brazil. The international sources are problematic. The international oil companies have cash at this point in time, but it's not clear that Brazil is the place where they want to put that cash in these very expensive, longer-term projects. So Petrobras's importance as a source of investment increases in this kind of international credit crunch, and Petrobras has announced a very ambitious investment program over the next 5 years. This is going to make Petrobras look, again, more attractive to whatever the government is in Brazil. The power generation issues in Brazil have not been resolved, even though currently Brazil is exporting energy. You go from the energy crisis of 2001, here 8 years later, Brazil's exporting electricity to Argentina and to Uruguay, but there still is that question of how do you integrate non-hydropower into a market in which hydropower is so cheap. Would privatization and deregulation undermine the natural gas alternatives that the Lula government as well as the Cardoso government think are necessary to have in case the climatic issues come back in a severe manner. And ultimately, the question for Brazil is, what is the combination of privatization and regulatory reform that will provide the best answers for these kinds of questions? It's not a case of, I've read lots of stuff about Petrobras should be totally privatized. It's not in the cards. I mean, this is not the issue in Brazil. The issue in Brazil is, what is that balance between having national energy companies and stimulating competition in the sector and generating investment. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today with y'all. I appreciate the invitation from Amy. It's always a real pleasure to work here at the Baker Institute. Sort of screwed up the time there that we're about to go. I'm going to be talking today about Argentina more generally, and particularly its experience, or its federal experience with energy. But to do so, I'm going to first need to provide an overall view of the political context, because I think, as David accurately noted, you really can't understand energy policy or anything the government does or any legislation without understanding the context in which it is occurring, and particularly the Argentine political context, where rules and laws are somewhat malleable. Next, given that Argentina is not a major petroleum player, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the natural gas and petroleum industry in Argentina, then focus on the real actors in the provincial energy scheme, which are the Petro-Provinces, the ones that are most active, then discuss the current hydrocarbon legislation, and then end with, which is particularly the short law passed in 2006, and then look at sort of two implementations of it in practice. Has some real basic things. Argentina is a presidential republic, has a bicameral legislature. Congress, while not the dominant actor like in the United States in terms of its role in the policy process, is a very important actor in Argentina. And in large part, the members of the Congress, the deputies and the senators, tend to respond to the provincial leaders, the governors, which gives the governors in the federal system a great level of importance. And then within the federal system, the provinces exercise a great deal of autonomy. This is particularly the case for the Petro-Provinces because they have an independent source of revenue, that is the oil and natural gas royalties. So in terms of independence, we find the Petro-Provinces particularly independent-minded. When we're looking at political careers, the functioning of politics in Argentina, everything comes up from the province. So your political career is based in your province. Political support of politicians is based in their province. And members of the Congress, even though they're in the national government in Buenos Aires, follow the orders of the provincial governors. So everything is provincial based. In particular, things like the provincial party machines which run politics in the country. So you'll have a single governor in a province. They have a machine that, for at least as long as they're in power, as long as they control office, they run the entire province. Essentially, you have very few provinces where there's any really serious opposition to the governor. In most provinces, the governor's word is law, and as long as they have the power. And particularly, this power is based on patronage, pork, and clientelism. There's talk about shortly. Politics in Argentina isn't about ideology, it isn't about policy, it's about resources. Now people will say and sort of use as convenient lip service or cover ideology a lot of the time, but really in the end it's about control of resources, because in Argentina, at the provincial level and the national level, if you don't control resources, if you don't have the funds to provide jobs, to provide contracts, to provide forms of clientelism, you lose control. In Argentina, the term generally is Caja, that's sort of the cash box. If you don't have that, you can't make things work. And so for a politician, if you're a governor, what you're primarily concerned with is generating revenue. Generating revenue that allows you to control your machine, keep control of your machine, and fend off threats from anybody else. And this is both the case at the municipal level for mayors, it's the case for governors, and it's the case for the president. The way that the Kirchner couple, which runs the country now, Nestor Kirchner is technically not president anymore, though he still makes most of the key policy decisions. Cristina Fernandez, the Kirchner, is the present president. The two of them, the way they make decisions is primarily in terms of maintaining resources and maintaining control, and they'll do whatever is necessary in order to maintain control. But maintain control in the short term, because the political reality for an Argentine politician is very short-term minded. No one thinks in terms of the long-term future. Short term's today, medium term this month. The most you can get long-term is maybe the next congressional election, and at the most for today in Argentina, maybe 2011, which is the next presidential election. But time beyond 2011 for an Argentine politician doesn't exist. There's no real reason to even discuss it. So as a result, you can have a contract for today, you can have rules for today, but they're only really good today. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in a few months. Once the current people leave office, be it at the provincial level or the national level, whatever agreement you made with them, whatever agreement you signed with them, is up for grabs. There is really very limited rule of law in Argentina, and you really, if you're a company, have very little legal recourse in terms of actually trying to resolve a contract that gets broken. You can just ask people who bought foreign debt in Argentina, or Argentine retirees who just had their entire retirement savings taken away from them and by the government. As a result of this, we tend to see a lot of lack of investment by many groups, or at least on average in the country, and a real tendency to sacrifice the future for the present. As a result, Argentina has tended to, throughout its history, to have these cyclical crises. It goes up and goes down, goes up and it goes down. So we'll have periods of boom, periods of bust. Unfortunately, right now we're entering a period of down cycle. Okay. Now, the governance style of the Kirchners isn't all that atypical of most Argentine political leaders. They tend to govern the national government now like they governed Santa Cruz when they held the governorship there from '91 to 2003. So an extreme concentration of power in the hands of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people. Cristina Fernandez, Nestor Kirchner, and then their two closest confidants, at least now Julio De Vito and Carlos Zanini. These are the people who make decisions. Ministers of government don't make any decisions. If you're a minister of economy, you don't have the right to make any real decision. The Secretary of Energy doesn't have any say whatsoever on any aspect of energy policy. In part, I don't think he wants to, because I think he looks at the future and sort of sees maybe it's best not to sign things today. But in terms of the policy, it's highly concentrated. At the same time, dissent isn't very much tolerated in Argentina. If you do dissent or criticize the Kirchners openly, or Cristina Fernandez, particularly if you're in the business sector, you suffer the consequences. Shell, for example, the president of Shell in Argentina has been an outspoken critic of the Kirchners, at least in the past, and as a result, Shell has had plants closed for environmental violations. It's had mobs storm its service stations. It's had the president call for a boycott. So essentially, and this happens to a lot of the business community. So most of the business community avoids, where possible, any criticism of the Kirchners, since it isn't really good for business at all. But the Kirchners are losing control. The economy is going downhill, and since their power is based on economic resources, in combination with public opinion, which is also the approval ratings have dropped for Cristina Fernandez to a little over 50 to a little around 25, 30 now. The Kirchners are losing control, so they're in power now. They certainly will not obtain re-election in 2011, but they'll probably control things in 2011. But from a business perspective, any deal you cut with the Kirchners now, don't know if it's going to be honored by the next Peronist president. And this is essentially the power couple that runs things. It's just one of my favorite pictures. It's Julio De Vito in Juan Perón's Cadillac with Hugo Chavez. So an indication of where things sometimes go in Argentina. And lastly, I've talked about all of this, but in terms of how you run business in Argentina, okay, there are lots of arbitrary, essentially the government makes lots of decisions now in terms of price controls, subsidies, export controls. Can you export, can you not export? At what price can you export? You get attacked if you challenge the government. State companies are growing, so we've had some nationalization in several sectors. There's been a big push by the Kirchners to get their friends, that is friendly local capitalists, people who work with them, but Argentines, bought in as either taking over foreign-run companies in the, say, public utilities sector, or at least coming in as minority partners. And Generally, for business model works in Argentina, if you have good relations with the Kirchners, you can make a profit. If you have bad relations, you probably aren't going to make a profit. Now, what about energy in Argentina? Now, recently, there has been limited investment. David showed sort of the decline in energy security. That's in part due to the lack of investment by most energy companies, or at least the reduction in investment since the early 2000s. We have essentially some modest petroleum and refined product export. It's tough to tell now with the economic decline, but it looks like Argentina is going to become a net petroleum importer at some point in the next 2 or 3 years. Depends if the economy really crashes, then maybe it'll be a few years longer. But production is declining. Natural gas, right now, Argentina, though it has the potential to be a natural gas exporter, barely, is now a net natural gas importer, in part because it's bringing in more from Bolivia than it's sending to Chile, and it's not sending anything at all to Uruguay. And we'll have to see this winter if it brings in LNG again. Last year, it spent quite a lot of money having the Excelsior docked in Bahia Blanca for the entire winter. I don't know if they'll need to do that this year. Now, Argentina is unusual in the world in that for its primary energy base, it relies heavily on natural gas. Roughly half of all primary energy use in Argentina comes from natural gas, followed by petroleum, then a tiny bit of hydro, though it does import a lot of the Brazilian surplus electricity and Paraguayan electricity when that's not needed in Brazil or Paraguay, and then 2 nuclear plants, and then a little bit of coal, wind, biodiesel, et cetera. Now, the major companies in natural gas, sort of 3 dominant players, Repsol YPF, are Spaniards who recently brought in some Argentine local partners, in part to reduce, the Spaniards wanted to reduce their exposure, and in part having the local partners helps to get things done. The French, Total Austral, and then Pan American Energy, which is BP and Bridas. Bridas is an Argentine firm run by the Bulgaroni brothers. Then Petrobras, Plus Petro, and Apache from here in Houston. And then Petroleum, once again, Repsol YPF, a dominant player, followed by Pan American, and then several minor players, Chevron, Petrobras, Occidental, and Tech Petrol. So, but you can see Repsol YPF and Pan American are sort of 2 of in terms of private, are 2 of the major players. And where Pan American's been a little different from some of its colleagues is that Pan American's been doing a lot more investment. So we actually see Pan American actively engaged in investment in the region, in part because Pan American, I would say, is probably the most savvy of the energy companies in Argentina in terms of knowing how to get things done and making things work, whereas some of the French haven't been nearly as successful, Chevron not as successful, and YPF is in a different role just because they're such a dominant player, and the fact that they control the a lot of the former installations of the former nationalized the National Petroleum Company. Now, OFEPI, when we get into the provinces, this is the organization of the hydrocarbon producing provinces. So there are several of them, 10 altogether, but of this group, only like a small handful are important. So I'm going to go over those in a second. But all of these members are, all these provinces, and this is out of 23 provinces in the federal capital, are members of OFEPI, even though some, like Formosa and Jujuy, produce virtually nothing. Okay, that map's a little too small. The idea, most of the provinces that we'll be focusing on, Neuquén, so in the far south, we have Tierra del Fuego in the far, then Santa Cruz, then Chubut, then Neuquén. So essentially Patagonia. Most of the production of petroleum products in Argentina is in Patagonia, and then the far north is Salta, where you have some significant natural gas production. And here we have the proven natural gas reserves. Neuquén is by far has by far the largest reserves in natural gas, followed by Salta, Tierra del Fuego, Santa Cruz, things in the national jurisdiction, mostly offshore, Chubut, Mendoza, and then a small number of actors. But you can see in terms of the concentration, it's highly concentrated in Neuquén, Salta, and then a couple others, Tierra del Fuego and Santa Cruz and production's parallels this roughly in terms production numbers are a lot harder to get. Numbers in general in Argentina are tough to get these days because like there is no inflation rate really that's credible, and so a lot of things everything's always a little off, so it's probably best to round. Petroleum reserves, it's sort of a flip side. The position of dominant actor here is Chubut in terms of reserves, with Santa Cruz next. And this is mostly, it's all in the same area. It's the San Jorge Gulf, which is right along the Chubut-Santa Cruz border. That's where most of Argentina's petroleum is today in terms of the actual reserves. Chubut, Santa Cruz, but mostly all of this is down in Patagonia, and even Mendoza, it's in the very far southern part of Mendoza, Malagüe is where Mendoza's reserves are. So overall, we can sort of divide the Argentine provinces into several groups. We have the major producing provinces, those that generate significant gas and/or petroleum, such as Neuquén and Chubut. Santa Cruz and Salta occupy a middle ground where they have, at least in Santa Cruz in petroleum, Salta in gas, have a significant share of reserves and production. And then the not completely minor producers, places like La Pampa, Formosa, and Jujuy, but Mendoza, Tierra del Fuego, and Rio Negro have some participation, though it's clearly not close to that of Neuquén and Chubut. Now, in terms of Neuquén and Chubut, a couple things to keep in mind, because we sort of have different we have the national political game where the Kirchners are on their way out. So, you know, by 2011, the Kirchners are going to be gone. In Neuquén, that's not going to be the case. Jorge Sapag was recently elected governor in 2007. He'll be reelected in 2011 unless he completely blows it, which is very doubtful. And even into the future, his party, the MPM, which is a provincial party, has controlled things in Neuquén since '83 and likely is to continue controlling them. They're a very pragmatic party. They're essentially focused on provincial matters. They, for the most part, don't get involved in national politics, though one of their former leaders did slightly. But this is a party that is going to be there for a long time. Either Sapag himself or the party in general, and so things are very much more stable in Neuquén. Chubut, Mario das Neves is the governor. The downside is he can't run for re-election in 2011, and at the same time, Chubut somewhat is a competitive province in that it's not guaranteed that Peronist will win, though odds are the next governor will be a Peronist. The real question, though, is whether it's das Neves' wife or son, which would be his ideal person to replace him, and then he'd return in 2015, or if it's going to be another Peronist, such as Marcelo Guinle or Martín Bussi, who most likely you'd have a new game with them. Sort of any deal you had with Das Neves wouldn't be working anymore. And Das Neves does have some national ambition that he has dreams of being president, though that doesn't seem likely. One other thing to keep in mind with the Petro-Provinces is that they tend to be very small. And so when you think of the royalties, this sort of magnifies the importance of the royalties, because with the royalties, they can actually use these resources to keep control. Places like Neuquén, Chubut, Santa Cruz, small provinces, Tierra del Fuego as well. This isn't the case as much as in Mendoza and Salta, so the role of hydrocarbons in those provinces, even though they have some significant percentages, is much lower, just because they're much bigger provinces, much larger economies. But places like Neuquén, Chubut, Santa Cruz, Tierra del Fuego, and Patagonia, the hydrocarbon industry is sort of the main, it's the only real thing in town, other than sheep and some tourism in a couple of the areas. Now, I'm going to end with the hydrocarbon legislation. Just some real basic things. 1958, we had the nationalization. 1967, a law was passed that technically recognized the provinces had the rights over the hydrocarbons and installed royalties, but since you had a state oil company, YPF, nothing really happened until 1989. That's when the sort of partial denationalization, privatization process got underway with President Carlos Menem, which culminated in 1992 with the federalization of hydrocarbons, so going to the provinces, and YPF's privatization. Then these the rights of the provinces to the hydrocarbons, that these were in provincial domain, was enshrined in the Constitution and received constitutional status with the reform of 1994. Now, the short law, which was recently passed in 2006, essentially implements, sort of more directly, Law 17319, okay, about 40 years later, I guess, but finally implemented it, and that the provinces gain complete control over hydrocarbon reserves in all of their territory, plus up to 12 maritime miles. They also have, so within these, they have the right now to grant concessions for exploration, for production, to negotiate royalties and any other payments, and in general conduct all negotiations related to the concession. So they make the deal. But the national government still gets to decide all energy policy. So they get to decide if you can export, can't export. They get to decide if you're going to export, is there a tax, what the tax is. They can decide what the price is going to be paid for natural gas, what the price is going to be paid for petroleum. They're going to decide if you're going to pay any transport taxes. They're going to decide if you can take deductions based on, for investment. And in general, they're going to regulate the entire hydrocarbon industry. So while the provinces have the ability to do the concessions, the national government is still a very active player in that they get to decide a lot of the key issues involved in the profitability of any investment. Now, the Ley Corta was called a short law because it was intended to be just for the time being, and there'd be, with the idea that there'd be a new national hydrocarbons laws that would sort of revamp and modernize everything at some point in the future. Well, that's not going to happen anytime in the near future, but at least that's the idea. In the interim, they're also going to create a committee to try to determine for concessions that are under national government control, how those should be transferred to the provinces, and then a federal organization with provincial and national government representation to coordinate energy policy. Now all this sort of got left to the side for now. What the provinces really wanted was the ability to do the concessions. Once they achieved that, and also now that Nestor Kirchner is sort of on his way out, none of this is probably going to get negotiated for the next couple of years. Everybody will wait till the new president takes office in 2011. In 2011. Now we can see this new legislation in practice. One example is Chubut, an agreement they signed with Pan American with the Dragon Hill, Cerro Dragon field that gives them, essentially extended the concession to 2027, and it also gives them the ability to add on 20 more years if they carry out a series of investments. Now this has been somewhat criticized by the public in that it's a very advantageous deal for Pan American, but this is sort of one example. And the Gulf of San Jorge is down here at the bottom by Comodoro Rivadavia. That's the oil capital of Argentina. It's where Pan American has its local base and where the Chubut government keeps their local office as well, ironically in Pan American's building. But, and then, so that's the main area that was where the concession occurred. Now what did the Chubut get? They were able to negotiate an increase in royalties by 3%, a lot of investment, $2 billion by 2017, $3 billion by 2027. Remember, this is a province with about 450,000 people, so these sorts of investments actually have a big effect politically. The entire Chubut, everything in Chubut depends on petroleum, so it depends on the energy, the oil workers. There's also sort of a sweetener. There's $120 million for provincial infrastructure that Pan American's providing Chubut. They're expanding a host of social outreach programs, scholarships, schools, and training, which once again, given that it's a small province, you actually see a lot of this. It's not drowned by millions of people. When you have this few number of people, you actually can see it. They also withdrew a CIADI completed with international dispute resolution in the World Bank, and then maybe there are complaints, at least by the opposition, that there were other things involved. Well, that's sort of a positive side for how Chubut, the new legislation worked well for Chubut. Now what about Tierra del Fuego? Well, Tierra del Fuego has the same rights, but it's the problem. There's a cap on natural gas, so that's changing, but it's pretty low price. So essentially this is $2.50 per MMBTU, which is lower than at least more people, much lower than paying the Bolivians, and certainly lower than, say, the Argentines are paying for the Excelsior, which was about $17, $18 per MMBTU for the LNG imports. So in the end, Tierra del Fuego gets lower royalties because of this national government price cap. Also, all exports of gas from Tierra del Fuego to Chile have been prohibited by the national government. So there are pipelines there, but they can't they can't export anything. So whereas just across the island, Methanex has 4 big methanol plants that are operating at about 30% capacity because they can't get their contractually agreed amount of gas from Tierra del Fuego. So So Tierra del Fuego is losing market there. It's losing potential royalties. It also, given that there's only one real pipeline off the island going up to the mainland of Argentina, the San Martin line, that's at capacity, and the government's responsible for that investment, Tierra del Fuego can't export or at least get its gas out to market. So in the end, they're being highly constrained. This is just down at the bottom is the Methanex Chile line that essentially is shut off because it can't be used. So as a result, the Tierra del Fuego government's getting fewer royalties due both to the export restrictions. They're getting fewer royalties due to the inability to transport up to the mainland. And they're also losing the big client because Methanex constructed those 4 methanol plants down in southern Chile precisely because they were across the border from Tierra del Fuego, which had ample natural gas, but not too many markets for the natural gas. But now Methanex is spending a lot of money doing exploration in the Fell Block and other places, Otway Block there in Chile. It's developing coal-powered electricity generation for their own devices. And they also are now pretty sour on Argentina as a supplier and unlikely to enter any agreements without a healthy dose of skepticism anytime in the future because they've been pretty burned by by the complete cutoff. And so in the end, in Tierra del Fuego, the governor, Fabiana Rios, probably isn't going to get reelected in 2011. She has a lot of budget problems, really needs the money from the gas exports, but because of the national government policy, she's not getting it, and so she's going to be defeated because she can't maintain the structure of government. So finally, in Argentina, just a few points. Governors are powerful political actors. It's a federal state. There's also, though, a very short-term vision of politics. And at the same time, the rule of law is very weak. So we can have a law today, but in 5 years, who knows if it will still be valid. Certainly, you have to put a high discount rate on any of those agreements. We'll have a new president. It will be a Peronist in 2011. Who it is, we don't know yet. Probably it's going to be someone who's more pro-market than the Kirchners. The present system of concessions provides a key power to the provinces, so it really does allow them to cut deals. But the company that makes that deal with them also has to deal with the national government, because if you don't have an agreement with both the national government and the provincial governments, you can't really close the whole thing. Whereas, so Pan American's a good example of somebody who was able to work out a deal with the provincial government for the concession, but also was able to work out a deal that made economic sense with the national government. In Tierra del Fuego, the gas producers down there have not been able to work out a similar deal with the national government, and therefore, and at the same time, nor has Fabiana Rios, the governor, and as a result, the new legislation really hasn't helped, this autonomy hasn't really helped Tierra del Fuego all that much. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions.
I should start by thanking the Baker Institute and the Council of the Americas for their kind invitation to Susan, Amy, Eric, and Erica. Thank you very much. Before I get started, I want to make very clear that the contents of the presentation are my sole responsibility, and they in no way express the views of the institutions I am affiliated with. The presentation is divided into 2 parts. First, I'm going to show the facts that portray the performance of the Venezuelan oil sector over the last 10 years. And in the second part, I'm going to do my best to make an interpretation of that performance, to look into the political economy of the oil sector in Venezuela since 1997. And actually, I'm going to look at the rise and fall of PDVSA since 1975. That will be in the second part of the presentation. Let me start then with the facts. And the facts are very important discussing because there is huge discrepancy between the figures reported by the international agencies and those given by the Venezuelan authorities. Then we have to define what we're discussing. First is crude oil production. This is crude oil production in Venezuela as reported monthly by the International Energy Agency between January 97 and December 08. And there is a fact here that I want to highlight. This is the strike, this break here, the strike of the oil industry between December 02 and February 03. And after the strike, there has been a permanent downward trend in crude oil production in Venezuela. I'm going to argue that that is the consequence of the massive loss of knowledge, know-how, and engineering capacity after the strike as a consequence of roughly 2/3 of the professionals leaving the company and not returning and not being replaced. This sort of profile in terms of figures is shared by both the Department of Energy of the US and OPEC. Then we have a drop in production of around 45% between December 97 and December 08. The drop in PDVSA's own production has been partially offset by coming on stream of the strategic associations, which were joint ventures between PDVSA and private company to produce and process the extra heavy oils from the Orinoco Belt. Those were 4 large upgraders in eastern Venezuela that were signed, those contracts, by mid-1990s and came on stream as from 2000. They reached peak production of 600,000 and present are producing 530,000 barrels per day. The strategic associations were nationalized, were run by private companies and were nationalized on May 1st, 07. These are the official figures, annual figures, and the source is the official Ministry of Energy and Petroleum publication, the Petróleo y otros datos estadísticos, up to 05 when it stopped being produced, and then are the PDVSA statements, public statements, and for 08 is the statement by September. This is the official crude oil production figure, and according to official figures, PDVSA's own production has also dropped from 97, but has a slightly increased as from 04. And this is how it compares with the international agencies' figures. It has dropped 13% according to the government. Production has dropped by 42% on average, 97, 08, according to the International Energy Agency. This is the production in the strategic associations, and it's very similar, both sets of figures. It reached peak production at 600 barrels per day in 05, but it has dropped since. At present, it's around 500,000 barrels per day. Then adding up PDVSA's own production plus the strategic associations, we have total crude oil production in Venezuela. And according to official figures, production nowadays is similar to that of 97. Actually, it's slightly higher at present as compared to 97. Then there shouldn't be a problem. However, when we resort to the international agencies' figures, production overall, total crude oil production in Venezuela nowadays is 26% lower, and most important, has been falling steadily since 05. It has never recovered from the loss that the strike represented. This is the main figures regarding crude oil production. Now I'm going to move to domestic consumption. This is very important because there is a huge discrepancy between reported official domestic consumption figures and those estimated by analysts, including myself. And if you have increasing domestic consumption vis-a-vis falling production, that means that exports could be falling much faster than production. This is domestic crude oil consumption, petroleum consumption, as reported by government. You can see there that it dropped in 2003, a consequence of the strike, but never recovered, according to the official figures. Petroleum consumption in Venezuela should be now similar in 2007 and 2008 to that of 2002. I take 2002 as a reference because it is last year it was officially published. From 2002 onwards are implicit in the PDVSA statements, and up to 2002 PDVSA was basically run by the bunch of professionals that left afterwards. If I take 2002 as a reference and estimate that petroleum consumption increases at slightly lower pace than overall economic growth, instead of consuming 580,000 barrels per day, Venezuela could be consuming nowadays around 800,000 barrels. And I show in a minute what this represents as a share of total consumption. But let me argue why I believe the estimate figure is much closer to reality than the official figure. And there are at least 5 reasons to believe this. The first one is that the economy grew at a very fast pace between 2002 and 2008. It grew, GDP grew by 51%. I'm assuming in this calculation that domestic fuel consumption increased by 44%. In Venezuela, historically, consumption increases with economic activity, even more so in this case that prices have remained constant in nominal terms. The automobile fleet increased by 50% over these 6 years, and there were no reasons at all to retire the old fleet. Then that's another reason to believe that there has been an important increase in domestic fuel consumption. The third reason is that nominal prices in Bolivar terms have remained constant at the time when consumer price index grew by more than 200%. Then the relative price of gasoline has fallen, and that incentivizes consumption. Perhaps more important is that the nominal price of gasoline in dollar terms has remained constant, calculated at the official exchange rate. At the parallel exchange rate, there has been a huge drop, actually, in domestic prices in dollar terms. It is 14 cents of a dollar per gallon. And there is a huge price differential between Venezuela and neighboring countries. The price ratio between Venezuela and Colombia, it has been between 20 and 30%, and that is a huge incentive for smuggling gasoline, not just to Colombia, but to Caribbean. I mean, there are estimates that say that this smuggling of gasoline could be in the order of 100,000 barrels per day. The fifth reason is that there has been a drop in the production of associated gas as production of crude oil has fallen in western Venezuela, where the bulk of electricity is thermogenerated, and there has been a sizable amount of liquids burned to generate electricity in western Venezuela. Those 5 reasons, I believe, support the assumption that instead of remaining constant, petroleum consumption in Venezuela over the last 6 years, it has increased, and it has increased by amounts of the order of magnitude I am assuming. If this is the case, and production has been falling, and domestic consumption has been going up, then as a share, it has increased greatly. It has gone up from 12% up to 45% of PDVSA's own production is dedicated to supply the domestic market. This has 2 very important consequences. The first is a cash consequence for PDVSA. This gasoline sold domestically, I repeat, is being sold at 14 cents of a dollar per gallon. That is roughly $6 per barrel of gasoline, what PDVSA gets. Producing that gasoline, I mean producing the crude oil, refining, distributing, and retail selling that oil could be in the order of $26, the cost, the operational cost. That means that per barrel of gasoline sold domestically, PDVSA could be making a loss of around $20. At 750,000 barrels per day, that represents a net loss for PDVSA in the order of between $5 and $6 billion per year. And when prices were going up, that subsidy, everything could be subsidized. But at present price level, $6 billion could be 1/4 of total petroleum exports this year. That's why this discussion is worth having. The other one that is obvious is that as consumption increases, there is a squeeze in the exportable surplus, where I move next. These are the official export figures according to the minister and PDVSA. Venezuela should be exporting at present roughly the same as in '97, roughly 3 million barrels per day. However, taking into account the International Energy Agency figures and the estimated domestic consumption figures, exports, total petroleum exports from Venezuela could have dropped in volume by 40%. Obviously, whilst prices increased sixfold between 2002 and 2008, they more than compensated the drop in volumes. This becomes very important now that prices are falling. This is total exports. However, the strategic associations go per design for exports. Then I want to see how the PDVSA own exports have evolved, because PDVSA, it's on its own that is supplying the domestic market. Then according to the official figures, when we subtract from total exports the strategic associations, PDVSA's own exports have declined by roughly 17% since '97. However, taking into account the International Energy Agency figures and the estimated figures for domestic consumption, total exports, PDVSA own exports, excluding the strategic associations, could have dropped by 60% over the last 10 years, and the downward trend continues. Then, to see to give a sense of credibility to this, I look at the demand side, and I look at what the importing countries are reporting as exports from Venezuela. And the first to look at is the U.S. These are the Energy Information Administration of the Department of Energy figures for U.S. imports from Venezuela, and have dropped by around 1/6 between '97 and '08. They break it down between crudes and products, and the drop has been basically in products. Petroleum products imported from Venezuela have dropped by roughly 2/3. And this is because, my interpretation is that it's because of two reasons. First, lower exportable surplus in Venezuela as domestic consumption increases. And second, that the strike also affected the refineries, and the products are coming out of a specification and they are not accepted in the US market. But there is something else to the U.S. imports from Venezuela. I knew I was going to forget this. This slide all wants to show, this is monthly, U.S. imports from Venezuela, is that the trend accelerated, the downward trend accelerated in '08. It's far from recovering. Is the exports into the U.S. are falling sharper, have done so over the last 12 months. But there is something else to U.S. imports from Venezuela, because as I said before, per design, the strategic association's exports coming to the US. Then we can break this down into exports from the strategic associations and PDVSA's own export to supply its network in the US, namely Citgo. Then what we see here is that PDVSA's own exports into the US have dropped since 97 by roughly 2/3. And again, the trend has accelerated. If this is true, and it is true, it's reported by the Department of Energy, PDVSA could be exporting on its own, taking apart the strategic associations, between 600 and 700,000 barrels per day as compared to 1.4 million barrels per day 8 years ago. This is from 2000. And this should be barely enough to fill up the Citgo network. Then PDVSA, according to these figures, is not selling to third parties, but just feeding up its own network. Finally, to end this first part of the presentation regarding the performance of the oil sector, we have total exports and we have imports from the US. Then we can calculate as a residual the exports to other markets from Venezuela. And again, this is calculated as a residual. And export to third markets have fallen sharply or sharper than total exports. Exports to third markets have dropped between 97 and 08 by roughly 2/3, and at present are somewhere between 400 and 500,000 barrels per day. The bulk of this is not sold into the open market or to commercial clients, but essentially are government-to-government agreements from Venezuela. 400,000 roughly are to supply Latin American and Caribbean governments. 300,000 go to Petro-Caribbean, the Caribbean. More than 100,000 are going just to Cuba, and the rest to South America. And then that's roughly 400, and the rest, roughly 100,000, are going to China nowadays. Then what we see here, if we believe this, what the international agencies are saying, is that there has been a huge drop in Venezuela petroleum production, particularly with regards to PDVSA own production, that the trend has become irreversible after the strike, that the consequences of the strike that took place 6 years ago these days are long-lasting, and that there is no reversion in that trend. And that drop in production has been partially offset by the increase in production by private companies under the strategic associations, and that came to an end when all of them came on stream in 2005. And since then it has slightly declined. And the second conclusion is that the drop in exports is much faster than the drop in production because of the sharp increase in domestic consumption, basically as a consequence of the extremely cheap price of gasoline in Venezuela. Then I am going to try to make some sense of all this, and I shall describe what is underlying what I call the rise and fall of PDVSA since it was nationalized on January 1st, 1976, legally in 1975, but the day it began working as PDVSA is January 1st, 1976, up to now. And to understand what is happening now, I want to look which were the keys to PDVSA's success. And if I had to summarize it in one phrase, it would be an arm's length relationship between the owner, the state, and the professional management of the companies. That I have my misgivings with the term nationalism, because I think those managers were as nationalist as anyone else, and they run a first-class oil company. I would say that there are 5 key points as a consequence or reflecting this arm's length relationship. First, it was the way the nationalization itself took place. It was a seamless nationalization. Nothing changed between December 31st, 75 and January 1st, 76. And that was the consequence of a wide, from right to left, political consensus around nationalization in Venezuela. And the political class at the time was very much aware that they had to make sure the operational continuity of the corporation, and that was secured at the time. It was negotiated with the Venezuelans. The bulk of personnel in running the international oil companies in Venezuela at the time were Venezuelans, and they remain in their positions. After that, there was no interference whatsoever for 25 years with the personal management and the operational decision-making. There was a clear division of labor between government and the state-owned company. The operational personnel management systems, as well as those of checks and balances, were inherited and internalized from the international oil companies into the different PDVSA affiliates. PDVSA was very much run as a private company with a formal relationship through the shareholder meetings with the owner, represented by the Minister of Energy and Mines at the time. And PDVSA's performance was a state-owned company ruled by private law, and it was under the Code of Commerce, what secured transparency. And finally, there was a clear-cut and transparent revenue distribution rules. I mean, PDVSA would pay royalties and taxes and retain profits for investment. This made possible that PDVSA would be run as a private first-class oil company with long-term planning and a strategic vision over the midterm. We would produce annually a midterm plan that was reviewed every year. And there were at least 4 phases in the development of PDVSA up to the late 1990s. Consolidation, I'm not going to go into the details of this, from the mid-70s to late 80s, and production was consolidated at 2.5 million barrels per day, and refining domestic capacity was upgraded and sustained at 1.4. Then it was internationalization, and the jewel of the crown here was the acquisition of the Citgo network from 7-Eleven. Then it was expansion in the late, all along the 1990s, and the key point here was the opening strategy to private capital, either under strategic associations or service contracts, and production increased to 3.5. And finally, the restructuring of PDVSA from 3 vertically integrated companies into a single company named PDVSA. What happened as from 1999? I think the key word here is government control of PDVSA, wanting to make PDVSA a branch of central government. And that was made clear in 3 ways. First, as from 1999 itself, interference in personnel management and operations, putting pressure on PDVSA professional management to hire people or to promote people on the basis of political alliance more than personal or professional merits. Second, the use of PDVSA resources, financial and personnel, for government policies not related to the oil industry. And third, and I would say very important, a very discretional distribution of revenue. This led to a growing tension between the government that came to power in 1999 and PDVSA's professional management. And that growing tension was resolved with the all-out strike and the demise of PDVSA as a first-class company. The outcome of the strike was that half the personnel left the company, 2/3 of the managers and professionals, and the estimated time of experience lost as a consequence of the strike was 282,000 years of experience. These professionals now are producing oil around the world. They are in Calgary, in this city, in Mexico, Bogota, in Riyadh, producing oil in Siberia, and 2 or 3 are in Washington, teaching at Georgetown. And this is the consequence. The basic consequence is that we described above. I should end with a more positive note, I believe. Getting the Venezuelan oil sector out of this hole will require, I would say, at least 3 things. First is the political decision to do so, the political will to rescue the oil industry. And for that to happen, we cannot resort to the previous model. PDVSA, as it was, cannot be recreated. I am a firm believer that recreating the Venezuelan oil sector requires a different institutional arrangement, a different institutional setup, very much similar to that the Colombians and Brazil copied from Norway. An independent agency and non-operating regulatory agency, and the state-owned company, much smaller than it was, competing with private companies. And the third element for recovering the sector is opening to the private participation. It's the only shortcut to recover the massive loss of knowledge, know-how, and engineering capacity that Venezuela suffered as a consequence of this clash between the government and PDVSA's professional management. And with that, I finish, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I want to invite Professor Whitehead to the podium for some comments and have the panel come back, and then we'll open it up for the audience.
I don't have any overhead. In fact, I've only just heard the same speeches that you've heard, and so I'm reacting on the hoof to the fascinating presentations we've had. And each of them is so full and stimulating that it's quite a problem for me to work out how to say something which refers to all 3, rather than entering into points of detail about each one. I think the striking general picture that we need to start with is that in the 1980s, it still looked as though there was a fairly standard and not very successful formula for oil production through state-owned enterprises in South America. But as Amy Jaffe said at the very beginning, from the early 90s onwards, we have seen an extraordinary diversity of approaches to the organization of energy policy in the different countries. We've actually heard 3 cases. If we went round and added Bolivia and Ecuador and Colombia, we could get even more, and we'd find still further examples of an unexpected and remarkable degree of variation. Actually, the first chart that David Mares showed in his presentation did go beyond the Brazilian case and gave us a bit of a picture about the overall picture in South America. You may remember that he had 2 axes. He had resource nationalism and he had energy security, and he had half a dozen countries, and you could see that between 1995 and 2005, to take one example, Argentina went from one extreme to the other in this direction, and Venezuela went from one extreme to the other in the other direction. But even that wasn't the end of the story, because then Venezuela comes back down again on the energy security axis when he gets to 2008. And if you took Chile, if you happen to notice Chile stayed way over on the low resource nationalism side, but moved very far from the top to the bottom of the energy security scale, and so forth. So what we had was an extraordinary diversity of patterns, and one of the things, perhaps the only thing I can do in the short remarks I have here, is to reflect a little bit on the headings we might use to explain this variance. And my headings are, to anticipate what I'm going to say, history matters, institutions matter, geography or geopolitics matter, and technology and capital matter. So let's just take history matters first of all. And this is a comment which is not a criticism of what David had to say about Brazil, but it's kind of a contextualization. David rightly said that in the case of Brazil, they were very affected by the experiences of hyperinflation in the 1980s, and so that the policies that they adopted under Cardoso and then under Lula were an attempt to get away from that. And I agree with him there. However, let's just compare it with Venezuela and Argentina. The degree of collapse which accompanied the 1989 complete hyperinflationary collapse in Argentina, and in 1989 the Caracazo and the upheavals in Venezuela, was in fact a much more total break with the past, I think, brought about a much more total break with the past than was the case in Brazil. So history matters in the sense that although the Brazilians were trying to get away from an adverse history, they were actually doing it in an incremental way. They were doing it by taking what they already had and trying to make adjustments and reforms, whereas in the other two cases, Argentina and Venezuela, there was a complete and extreme dismantling, shall we say, of what had gone before. Well, in Argentina there was a complete dismantling. There was a switch. In order to understand this, what Mark Jones told us about Argentina after 2001, under the Kirchners, after 2003, we need to put that in the context of what happened under Menem. In many ways, the Kirchner policies can only be understood as a repudiation of everything that Menem had been doing in the 1990s, especially not just in energy policy, but in terms of a complete attempt to regulate the economy through international prices and international law under the convertibility plan. And of course, the key thing that changed in 2001 was that the Argentine state forcibly converted the contracts, which had been in dollars, into pesos, but not at the one-to-one rate, which the companies had assumed when they went into them, but at the 3-to-1 rate, with the prices therefore completely artificial, and they've remained artificial ever since. So we need to understand that historical background, both to see the gradualism, the incrementalism of the reform in Brazil, and also the absolute reversal in Argentina. Clearly, without extending this point about history too far, you'll understand from the last presentation on Venezuela that there was also at least one profound change of direction in 1999 onwards. Arguably, there was also an earlier change of policy at the beginning of the 90s, but that's not something I will go into now. Second variable would be institutions matter. And here, again, I want to make the contrast between Brazil on the one hand and Argentina and Venezuela on the other. David Mares stressed the role of presidentialism in Brazil, but think how, and he's right, that the initiatives were taken by the president, and it was very important when Cardoso left that the following president carried on those initiatives, and it will be very important for the future of Brazil whether the president who comes after Lula represents continuity and uses his presidential powers to continue this process of incremental adjustment, or whether he overturns the table, shall we say. But it's much more likely in the Brazilian context that the change of president will not result in a complete reversal of policy. In the case of the other two countries, we know the total upheaval that took place in Venezuela is the work of one particular president with an extremely unfettered personalist style, with a great deal of arbitrary power, and actually, I would say that the policy in the 1990s was also to some extent the product of a very strong presidential initiative taken by Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1990. So we see that on the one hand, we have forms of political leadership which are really at the discretion of the political incumbent, and on the other hand, we have much more controlled and institutionally regulated procedures. That's the Brazilian case. In fact, the key term that I would use to differentiate Brazil from Argentina and Venezuela is statecrafting. The details of this we can elaborate, but you'll remember the observations that Mark Jones made that time horizons were so short in Argentina that everybody takes it for granted that whatever they do now, the rules will change and nothing will be predictable or enforceable after 2011. The same is true, clearly, with regards to Chavez, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important for Chavez to convey the impression that he can be re-elected after 2013, because if the thought arose that in 2013 there might be a change of president, then all the assumptions on which all the economic actors were operating would disappear. By contrast, the economic actors and the political players in Brazil are working, and indeed the administrators of Petrobras are working with a long-term time horizon. They can say, for example, we have this plan to invest $175 billion in the pre-salts over the next 5 years, and it is not certain that the plan will be realized, needless to say, but it is credible for all the different parties and partners that they need to work with, who have to start producing the rigs and the technology, and have to plan for the future and recruit the staff and so on. It's believable that something along those lines will remain in place, whether Lula is there or not, whatever happens in the next political cycle. And the institutions underpinning energy policy in Brazil are just much more stable, and one of the great achievements of both Cardoso and subsequently Lula was to improve the stability, the interdependence and the predictability of those institutions, and to project them into the future. They were not always like that in Brazil, and if you think of the Collor de Mello regime, you can remember it didn't have to turn out that way, but that statecrafting has in fact been a key factor differentiating the Brazilian story from the Venezuelan and the now, the third, I just want briefly to state the obvious, that economic geography also matters. You can get away with a lot more of the kind of things that are happening in Venezuela if you have both the physical location that Venezuela has. This is a huge energy resource within close proximity to the United States. It's not got the security problems of the Middle East. It's got a tremendous range of physical advantages to it. And that means that those who are in charge of it have a degree of bargaining power and leeway and capacity to attract cooperation even on their adverse terms from external partners, which is very different from the case of Argentina. The case of Argentina, as we heard, is they're already net oil importers, and they're about to be net gas importers, the other way around, in the next year or two. They are not big players. They are at the margin of international energy integration schemes. They're more of a nuisance to their neighbors than an asset to their neighbors in terms of regional cooperation. And in fact, the key short-term expedient that is being used to keep the Venezuelan operation, the Argentine operation afloat is when you have an adverse price structure within Argentina, you therefore deter investment and development of your domestic resources. You supplement that by using foreign exchange from other places in order to import the energy that you ought to be producing domestically. That's a very different case, I think, from the Venezuelan case, because the geography is different. And of course, coming to, again, Brazil, Brazil is different in two fundamental respects. First of all, this is a country where it's a continent more than a country. It's an economy which has a great variety of different economic strengths across a wide domestic market, and it has the capacity, which the Petrobras initiative is trying to exploit, to develop its own capital goods industry so that it can actually supply much of the technology and much of the equipment that will be needed at reasonable cost, not perhaps at the lowest possible cost, but at reasonable cost over the long run, in order to fulfill its development strategy. And Petrobras's object was always, since it was founded, was basically a state enterprise to provide the energy needed for the domestic development of the Brazilian economy. Now, of course, the size of the salt deposits, the pre-salt deposits that they now have, can convert them into a great player on the world stage and can change that equilibrium in the end, although that's not going to happen for another 10 to 15 years. But in the meantime, this is a continent-sized country, the whole economy of which can be stimulated and articulated around development of the energy sector. Of course, the normal way we look at it is not so much to study the history, the geography, and the institutions. We look more at the economics of the energy sector, and I don't wish to prevent you from the more standard analysis about the availability of capital questions and the availability of technology questions that we always are familiar with in this subject, in this centre, and which I'm sure this centre spends a lot of time on. But I just highlight the fact that those questions are not independent of the other variables that I have been putting before you. For example, with the resources that Venezuela currently has, foreign capital can be raised even despite the very lamentable low quality of the management that is there. I don't really want to say too much on the details of Venezuela, but I think I should just perhaps, in order to open up the discussion, pass on to you without comment information or at least an alternative perspective on Venezuela that we got from people last week in Oxford who are associated with the management team. The key point that they made was, according to the people representing PDVSA in Vienna, they claim that the company has obtained independent certification of the current volume of production, which they claim to be 3.1 million barrels per day, and that they are therefore, and I'm not trying to say it's true, I'm saying there's a battle going on about it, there is therefore a forthcoming dispute in IEA about whether the figures that were the basis of the previous presentation are in fact entirely solid. We know that it's very hard to get the kind of evidence you need. The conditions in Venezuela make it very difficult to get that information. I'm not contradicting what the speaker said, I'm just alerting you to the fact it's a kind of expression of the degree of institutional disarray that there is in this sector, that there could be such profound disagreement on a central question. Even so, the same source said, yes, we may be producing 3.1 million barrels per day, we're going to have great difficulty in maintaining it. And the fact that President Chavez has won his referendum vote last week does not change the reality after that we are going, at current oil prices, independently of the volume, current oil prices, we are going to be facing very serious fiscal challenges, and it is not going to be possible for us to continue with the full range of expenditures out of the oil revenue that we have been doing, and that public opinion among the supporters of Chavez is not prepared for that. So the weakness of the institutions in Venezuela and the weakness of the institutions in Argentina together with the gravity of the crisis that we all know the world economy is going through at present, puts a very big question mark over any estimates about where either of those two countries' energy sectors will be going in the next period. I think there's much more confidence about where the Brazilian energy sector will be headed. But I have to say that even in the case of Brazil, the technological challenge and the administrative challenge of investing $175 billion in deep water pre-salt production of the kind that has never previously been achieved also raises a fundamental question mark and confirms that these are long-term questions across South America which we will have to keep studying for some time. Thank you.
Well, we want to welcome you all for participating for comments and questions. Okay, let me start, and I'm just going to ask the panel a general question. Let's say that the current low price environment was sustained for several years. I think we go out and discuss sort of strategy out in the Persian Gulf today. There are many countries with high reserves that are thinking that $40 is a good price, not only to get the global economy back on track, so say that's at least for 2 years, that you have to have a lower price, but maybe even beyond, because of the sort of entrenchment of unconventional oil and gas and the entrenchment of alternative energy incentives to sort of fuel the Gulf that for a variety of reasons, some of which might even be explained as geopolitical, the current price environment might be a sustained one for some period of time. Okay, see if the panel has any opinion on what that might mean for the kinds of policies that we're currently seeing in Latin America, whether they would make a change.
The first thing I would like to do is to put the low price into context. It's low price as compared to 140, but the average price in real terms for the 20th century in $2,000 was $20. That's the average price, and it was a trend with mean reversion. I mean, it was very stable price. The nominal price between January '86 and January 2002 monthly is $20. And then we went, I mean, we are a bit confused by what has happened, what happened between 2002 and 2008, that prices increased sevenfold. Then $40 is still twice as much as the average price for last century and the last 20 or 16 years ending in 2002. Then $40 is not, it's again, it's a low price as compared to what we had last year or the year before, but it's still a high price. At $40, most ongoing projects in Latin America can be sustained. My only doubt is the pre-salt. But even the pre-salt, I believe, can be developed at $40. I believe the longer-term equilibrium price will be higher than $40. Particularly because of what is more at the margin, based namely the tar sands, and that requires higher development cost. But at present, I wouldn't say that it could be because of cash flow problems, but not because of cost, production cost considerations. That's my taking in the.
I think this is sustained $40 over the next couple of years would have enormous political ramifications that will come back and affect the energy sector. But it's not the price of, part of what I tried to say with energy security is that it's not the price of the product per se, it's It's the way in which you think you're going to use that. And we have a number of governments that have bet very heavily on very high prices. They've restructured their whole political economies. They've changed their constitutions. They've changed politics. They've changed their economies, betting on those very high prices. If we have 2 years of $40 oil, even Ecuador is going to suffer political issues that are going to recreate what they tried to do in the past couple of years, not to mention Bolivia.
I just would make 2 points. Regarding Argentina, it has little effect because essentially that's what producers have been getting $40 because of the taxes and price controls. So it has relatively little effect in Argentina. I think region-wide, one of the effects of it dropping from the high levels is less money for Hugo Chavez to intervene in different polities in the region, particularly the smaller countries. So his ability to intervene in countries like Nicaragua or El Salvador has dropped precipitously from where it was when oil was much higher. A good example is an agreement he had with the FMLN mayors, the former guerrillas in El Salvador, to set up a refinery and essentially provide them with subsidized fuel, which hasn't got off the ground in part because he doesn't have the resources anymore.
Perhaps I can just add, there's the level of the price and the stability of the price. If the price was to stabilize at around $40 and people were to believe in it, well, one thing is that certain projects that were unwise would not be undertaken and could not be financed, so there'll be a positive side to that. I think some of the refinery plans are of that kind, for example. And we also need to bear in mind the impact on consumers as well as on producers, that in Latin America as a whole, needless to say more generally, there were countries and social groups which were on the brink of experiencing disastrous conditions if the prices had stayed up the way they were. If, for the Caribbean, for example, the prices were to stabilize at $40 a barrel, this would not be easy, but it's possible to live at that price. At very much more unstable prices, everybody, both producers and consumers, are in terrible disarray. And at consistently high prices, there would be bad projects that would go forward, and there would be needy and viable economic entities that would be choked.
I would like to ask 2 questions. One, is there a possibility that Brazil may consider joining OPEC, since it is likely to export? And also the same thing that Brazil with Petro-Provinces, so much of technology, why hasn't it become a multinational? I mean, at OTC they show that one. Why haven't they gone to other countries and start investing? And regarding Venezuela, you gave a pretty dim picture of Chavez, but at the same time he's trying to attract capital from China and maybe also joining or trying to get interest from Russia. So is it possible that he may succeed in terms of getting technical know-how from those countries, and it is also trying to develop relationship with India? The ONGC and even the private companies from India are showing some interest. So is there a possibility that some other relationship may be developing in the case of Venezuela?
Okay. I'm sorry I didn't have time to really present the picture of Petrobras, but Petrobras is a multinational corporation in the sense of ownership comes from around the world, and it invests around the world. It's got investments in the Gulf of Mexico. It's got, Mark showed us in Brazil, in Argentina, it's very present. It's the major player in the Bolivian gas fields. So that was my fault for not giving you that whole picture of Petrobras. But the goal of Petrobras is to work in the domestic environment and they've gone international to the extent that that is seen as a way of helping them accomplish their domestic tasks. In the case of OPEC, you know, the decision to join OPEC is a decision of costs and benefits. And Brazil isn't Venezuela. Brazil is an extremely large economy with very diverse political relationships around the world. I don't see how joining OPEC would be seen as a positive step for even the Lula government. And if we think that after Lula, which is just a couple of years, Sarney or somebody from the center right's going to come in, it would be even less likely.
It is true that because of both ideological and strategic reasons, Chavez is looking for new alliances, or with Russia on the one hand and China and India on the other. But before this has a noticeable effect, it will take time because of the limited resources of these companies themselves. I mean, they are widespread, they are far away from Venezuela. Whatever production they were going to get from Venezuela, there would be huge transportation costs before they get into China or India. Then it will be very slow development. It is there, but it's not comparable to what is needed to revert the downward trend in production. It is happening, but it will take time because of limited resources and other strategic considerations, because of the counterparts, because of the Russians. They have their own problems. The Chinese is spreading all over the place, but I mean, they have limited resources in terms of engineering also. And then the Indian companies also have a limited capacity to operate in Venezuela because of the distance.
Okay, well, I think it's Yvonne. Oh, one more question?
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one is about how do you see the change in Washington will affect the energy policy in Latin America, mainly these three countries? And the second question about Bolivia. I mean, it's a country that produces large amount of natural gas that's affecting Brazil and Argentina and the whole region. And with dropping in oil prices, where that's going to go strategically, what do you think Morales is going to do?
Okay, let me take the Bolivia question. Even before the oil prices began to fall precipitously, Bolivia was having problems. It can't attract the investment that is necessary in order to bring that gas online. It hasn't been meeting its contracted volumes with Argentina. There was an effort to get Brazil to send some of that gas that it does send to Brazil to Argentina. The Brazilians said, no way, we need it. Morales is just like Chavez in Venezuela. Morales is stimulating the domestic market, so at the same time that production is running into problems, domestic consumption is rising, leaving less for exports. So there's a big debate in Bolivia about the future of the gas industry, and I think these lower prices are going to have to make Morales, who I don't believe is as ideologically committed to pushing in this direction as, say, Chavez is. I think we're going to be seeing a moderation in Morales' behavior in the energy sector because the Constitution has already been changed. He's set up the institutional structure to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. Now what he's got to do is consolidate in order to have the resources to push that ahead.
I'll just take a quick stab at the U.S. administration. First, it's probably too early to tell anything. definitively. Certainly can't get any worse than it was during the final years of the Bush administration. So regardless, relations can only go up. But I think it'll be some time in terms of we can actually say, whether we can point to concrete examples of where they've gotten a lot better, but they can't get any worse, particularly with the South American countries. Things have gotten so bad with, between Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, everywhere maybe but Colombia. Things are sufficiently low that they can only go up.
Let me add that I don't think in the energy sector that the United States had that much of an impact on sort of the debacle of the energy cooperation hopes in Latin America. Those were responding very much to internal issues. If the Argentines and the Chileans can't agree on what their domestic political economies are going to look like, they can't integrate their markets. Bolivia, I mean, none of that had very much to do with the United States. It's a South American problem in South America. They're not on the same page.
Perhaps I could just add, we have been talking about South America, and of course if we are talking about the new US administration and energy cooperation, the relationship with Mexico is really going to be, I know that's next panel, but that's really going to be the most difficult and crucial test, I'd have thought.
Okay, well I think it's time for a coffee break so we can all re-energize.